So when it comes to food intolerances, very often people are confused. We often hear of allergies, and I want to clarify, I'm not referring to allergies when I refer to food intolerances. Very simple way to discriminate between the two. An allergy you're going to know about within minutes. Your body mounts an immediate reaction to an allergic food. An intolerance you don't know about immediately. In fact, it can take up to 72 hours for the body's reaction to a food that it's intolerant to present itself. So that confusion there is also combined with how you test for this. And it's very common that intolerance testing is done by laboratories that don't have the latest science or reproducibility in their labs. So we get some false positives in terms of intolerances being come back positive when in fact they may not be. And that literally comes down to the quality of antigen or food that's presented to your blood and the immune markers in the blood there. So the lab that we use is recognized as the best in the world. Firstly, in terms of the quality of antigen library that they build and the consistency and reproducibility of those antigens. The second thing this lab is excellent at doing is taking the blood that arrives and splitting the sample and running it in parallel so that both results are within 5 to 10% range before they say that it's a valid test. So long as our client has exposed themselves in the right manner in the lead up to this test to the foods that they want to check, we are going to not get a false positive, and we're going to get a really highly accurate assessment of the food and the immune system and the reaction that may be sitting there under the radar. I could go into lots of detail about this, but the best thing I can do is give you a specific example or some case studies of some of our clients so that you can kind of get these concepts and how it can be quite specific to an individual. The first one I want to use is George, a 47-year-old Frenchman, who when he was younger was actually a really high-level tennis player. We're talking Roland Garros sort of style. He's now in a different role in life. He's in the city, he travels, he has lots of demands on his time, and he's not as fit as he used to be. 5 years ago, he had a trauma where his disc in his lumbar spine sequestrated. That's kind of the worst version of a ruptured disc that you can have. Literally the inside of the disc, the gel sprayed out across all of his nerves in his lower back. Required surgery for it to be resolved. And 5 years later, George is still experiencing 7 out of 10 pain down one leg all the way into the foot, like a real fizzing kind of pain. I assessed George, and lots of people have assessed George, and on the musculoskeletal side, his spine's actually moving quite well. His core's reasonably active. There wasn't really an obvious reason for him to still have these symptoms at this stage. Nevertheless, we put him through our program and we got some change, but bottom line was he was still getting sort of 7 out of 10 discomfort. We looked at everything we could, and then we decided that it was worth investigating the food side of things. Was there anything in his diet that could be potentially reacting to? So we ran him through a full barrage of intolerance testing. We test 180 foods, both cooked and uncooked, because that does change the nature of the protein. And what came back was really interesting. He had a specific reaction to wheat and gluten, and within that, there's 8 proteomes and enzymes you want to check. Trans-glutaminase 6, he was deeply positive for. Now, the interesting thing about this enzyme is that it expresses itself in neural tissue. So there was a test result saying that something inside George's diet was actually creating an immune response in the nervous system and specifically peripheral nerves. So I said, unfortunately, George, I know you're French, but I'm going to ask you to go off gluten and wheat for at least 2 weeks for us to test this. And, credit to George, he committed to this. We found that within 2 weeks, these 7 out of 10 symptoms had come down to 2 out of 10. And that's I found fascinating. I think it's really an example of how food intolerance can be linked not to just gut issues, but to our overall health. Second example I want to give you is Rose, a 12-year-old girl who was suffering from migraines, quite debilitating migraines that meant she would spend sometimes 2 to 3 days a week having to come home from school. She was unable to be in anywhere where there was light or noise or process information. And this is a very active 12-year-old who's running cross country, is quite gifted at that, but was also experiencing at the end of, say, a cross country event, transient vision loss. Now that means complete vision loss, tunneling that comes down. As you can understand, the child in question and the parents were very concerned by this, and they had run a series of tests by a neurologist to try and get to the bottom of this, and all to no success. This individual also had some stomach issues, and when I finally got to engage with her, we dig back into the history. There was a gut infection in Thailand, quite a big one, where both ends were going bad. And since then, there was a gut issue as well as the migraine, which seemed to coincide with the right time. So we ran a whole barrage of tests around the immune system, ruled out things like Epstein-Barr virus and Lyme and all the worst case scenarios. Only 2 positives came back from all the labs that we did. And the 2 positives were in the wheat and gluten profile, the gluteomorphine component, so the bit that reacts like an opioid in the brain, and in milk, the casomorphine protein, which again reacts with the brain like an opioid. So if you've ever gone off wheat or gluten and experienced almost a withdrawal-like symptoms that you have to have bread, maybe that's because the opioid factor is quite big for you. In this individual's case, I presented the results, and a 12-year-old being told they can't eat wheat, gluten, or milk doesn't go well. They don't want to be different. It's difficult. So we had a real tough time to get Rose to sort of take this on board. 5 weeks later, she implemented a 2-week trial on this and did not have one migraine and not one episode of transient vision loss. And ever since, only gets those issues when she does eat some bread or some milk, which I think is, again, instructional in showing us how specific some food intolerances can express themselves. So during the Ultimate 14, if you've noticed some big shifts in your gut health, in how your mind feels, or anything else that you perhaps didn't relate to changing your diet, and you're unsure as to what that item might be, you can get a very specific test to get some clarity on that. Now, the other thing about these intolerances, they're not permanent. If you take Amanda's pathway of resting and healing and rewilding, it is possible for you to have these foods again and not have a huge immune reaction. So you are not off this stuff for your whole life. But what you need to know is, what is your stomach or your immune system reacting to? So you can remove that while you do the healing process. Hope you found that interesting. I'm fascinated by this work, and if we can help you, give us a shout.